welcome to the Trauma and the You Try show. I am Karen Sims with the Trauma and Resiliency Initiative, and we are so happy that I have a great guest, Kayla from Races, and I'm going to let her do a formal introduction of herself and talk about Races. It is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and is also Child Abuse Prevention Month. And so I thought what an appropriate time to bring Kayla in, who's again, I don't want to do her bio, but she's an educator with Races, and she can definitely talk about some of the etiology of the month and how do we, and right, we're going to have a conversation about what we can do individually and collectively to end sexual violence. To that end, I want to make sure I remind folks that the views and the opinions of the guest are theirs, so that is always clear, and so that she can have a full, open, and transparent conversation here. And I am so happy to have you. So introduce yourself and
Yes.
tell us a little bit about yourself. And maybe people don't even know, and I'm going to let you do an introduction, but I know Races has had several evolutions. And so maybe even explain, what the resource is.
Yes. So hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Kayla DeCant. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the prevention education supervisor here at Races, which is just a fancy way to say that I oversee our prevention education programming, which includes both elementary school, middle school, high school education, but also community outreach, development, professional development. And I also run some of our trainings for volunteers and new staff. So that's a little bit about me and my position. I'm sure we can talk a ton more about what education means, and I can put on my nerd hat a little bit and talk about some of those things the logistics of it. But Races overall is the Rape Crisis Center for Champaign-Urbana. We serve a couple other counties. We serve Ford, Douglas, Piatt, and Champaign. And we offer exactly what our name kind of says, right? So we offer advocacy services, which can consist both of meeting folks at the hospital if they want to receive medical services or are receiving medical support after an experience. We also offer legal services if someone is interested in accessing either civil or criminal support, or if someone's just interested in knowing their other legal rights that they have as a survivor. There are many resources out there that a lot of survivors don't know about that they can access. And then we offer counseling and we offer education. And the biggest part as well of our agency is our 24/7 hotline. And that is a confidential crisis line that anyone can access. So not just survivors of sexual assault and sexual violence, but if you're a support person, a parent, a caregiver, a friend, a boyfriend, girlfriend, partner, roommate, whatever that might be, and you want to have some support and talk through those things, please feel free to call our hotline. We have a regular number and we also have a toll-free number. Like I said, that's open 24/7, nights, weekends, holidays, all that kind of stuff. A fully trained volunteer staff person will be there to answer your call and answer any questions you might have.
So thank you. I love that, because sometimes I run into folks who still do not know it's a resource, the depth and breadth of opportunities and supports that you offer. I think probably the best place, though, to begin this conversation is, what is sexual violence or sexual assault, right? Like there's so many different names, and
Yes.
People seem to get confused about what we're talking about. So when you're thinking about Races and the kinds of issues the kinds of support you offer, or what the issues you tackle, what would you say? What are we talking about?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I'm probably going to give a complicated answer because unfortunately this is kind of complicated. So I tend to use the term sexual violence, which is more commonly used in the field. And we use it because it's just a really broad word to describe anything on the spectrum of sexual violence, which we would describe as any sexual interaction without somebody's consent, right? And consent is a huge topic that we talk about in education. I think there's been a huge push to have more deeper, intense conversations about consent in the last 10 years, which is amazing, right? So that can include things like sexual harassment. It can include, rape or sexual assault. It can include stalking or other forms of like problematic relationship behavior. And we also know that sexual violence is kind of this amorphous being that someone might also experience with other types of violence or other forms of violence, which I know we'll talk about a little bit, kind of the intersectionalities of what that looks like. So we at Races are not here to like define somebody's experience. I never want to tell someone like, there's no checklist I can give you of like, oh, this is and this isn't, because it's really up to the person to decide how to define their experience. And I think that's another really important thing for people to know is that to receive our services, we're not going to like do a screening about your experiences, because again, we come from a survivor-centered place, which is to say that you as a survivor get to define all of this for yourself and you get to choose. And so part of that also means you get to define what you want to call it and how you want to identify yourself too, right? So some folks like to be called survivors. Some people want to be called victims. Some folks want to call it assault. Some people want to call it rape. And it can get really confusing, like you said, Karen, because some of that stuff gets into whether you're talking about like legally what it might be defined as, or societally what it might be defined as, or, what the hospital might call it versus what, unfortunately, there are a lot of terms that get thrown around, which is why I kind of like to keep this umbrella term of sexual violence when we talk about this work, like I said, because it can kind of encompass all the above. Yeah.
No, I love that definition, so it's so linked for, folks with our events, experiences, and effects definition of trauma. So it can be the things that you experience directly. It could be being in an environment that are hostile, that make you feel psychologically or emotionally unsafe, or it could be in the effects. Like if you grow up in a household where a sibling or a neighbor or your mom or other people in your community are sexualized, treated unfairly, mishandled, abused, all of those things that could also impact you and be shaping and defining. And so I love that broader definition, because I think some people really sort of exclude themselves from like accessing services because they're like, yeah, that doesn't count. And so I even think about like some of my like shaping and defining moments. I have, I've shared, I have a complicated trauma narrative. And I remember being sexually assaulted in college and having family members say, sometimes those things happen, like that's like sort of the normal college experience. And so had I internalized that definition and not had a feminist consciousness, and I want to definitely talk about what's different about sexual assault organizations than typical human services organizations. But had I internalized that definition, I would have been like, oh, I shouldn't be involved in looking for resources and supports because like in college, those things happen and the exact words were used. And I think pretty harmless was like, sometimes we put ourselves in situations, and those things just happen. So like, and like, I was like, wow, like, the complicated nature of sexual violence and how it so gets normalized in culture, experience, and community.
1000%, right? We are swimming in rape culture every day, right? That normalization of rape or sexual assault, and the idea that it's not a question of if it will happen to you, but when it will happen to you, and kind of seeing it as this like inevitable part of the human experience, particularly when we think about women or, women identified folks and other populations. It's seen as like, yeah, like we've all experienced it. It's just a thing and you got to move on, right? Which can kind of play into this trauma Olympics kind of that we like to talk about, right? Where it feels like someone else's experience was worse, or because of X, Y, or Z factor, I didn't have it as bad as somebody, or, it wasn't as severe or intense. And so therefore I don't deserve care, right? But if we know that that's not how trauma works and that's not how our experiences work, there's no metric for trauma. Trauma is based off of your experiences and your reactions to those experiences and how those have influenced you. So we really try to do as much as possible to help folks recognize that like we're not here to, interrogate your experiences or judge your experiences to try to decide whether or not services are correct for you, right? Like we trust and believe and support survivors for whatever that looks like for them.
I love that. You said something though that I think we should come back to. So, I'm gonna like keep us in like sixth grade levels. So just work with me. So
Yes.
you mentioned, and so I sort of said, hey, when what is unique, I think, about sexual assault, sexual violence, anti-sexual harassment, like right, like organizations like Racist, is that it has an anti-oppression orientation. So you talked about rape culture. What in the world? If I'm sitting in my living room, I'm like, what is she talking about? Rape culture? Like, I know about a lot of different things. Say more.
Yes. Another great question about how to define that. And I think that's part of the problem, is that it's what we experience every day. And so it's really hard to identify what that looks like. I think the two biggest parts that we tend to pull out when talking about rape culture is this idea of, one, victim blaming, and also objectification, right? Those are kind of the two big pieces that I tend to focus on when talking about it, because I think those are the easiest to like immediately recognize that we've experienced or heard that before. So victim blaming, when I'm talking about that, is just focusing on what the victim of the assault or of the violence did or didn't do, and sort of putting the blame on them for saying, you're responsible for the violence that you experienced or endured, right? We hear this, unfortunately, all of the time. Statements like, what were you wearing, or why were you wearing that? Why did you drink alcohol? Why did you go to that with that person? Why were you in that location in the first place, right? And even asking questions about like how they responded to the assault. Did you fight back? Did you yell? What did you say to them? Right? Again, that's us focusing as a society on what did the survivor or the victim do here, and not questioning what did the perpetrator or the person who caused harm do here, right? Like, what were their actions about? And let's focus on what they did, right? So we kind of are flipping this narrative and focusing so much on the person who should be receiving support and care from our community, right? Instead of focusing on the person who should probably be the one who's held accountable, which is a whole other conversation to talk about what accountability means. But I think that's sort of like the first biggest part of rape culture that we can identify, right? Because that is as how a culture, and I use the word culture very broadly, this is not just focused in the US, how we respond to sexual assault, right? And this is a very unique thing that we do in some other places too. And I'll make a connection in a second to kind of like racialized violence, because I know we want to go there. But I will pause for a second in case you have other questions about like that victim blaming part, or if you think I need to break it down, which I'm more than willing to do. So I agree that part of the problem sometimes with this is we get so technical and jargony.
Absolutely.
So feel free to call me out if I continue to do so.
And so I think that you explained that really, really well and clearly. And I want to, again, I probably should articulate language I use. So from an anti-oppression lens, where you realize that all oppressions are connected. And so not only does that victim blaming happen by the media, the culture, it sort of even is reinforced with like our biases and how we language things. I think, listening to, and people are not aware of this, right, in the media, but listening to the story about Matt Gaetz, like people like that the 17-year-old girl was identified as a woman, and the fact that some people speculate that she went on to be involved in pornography, right? Like she's like all of a sudden, the fact that she was like allegedly a victim of commercial sexual exploitation and assault that she could not consent to legally or in any other way because of so many different dynamics. But the story that's getting narrated already is dehumanizing. Or when we were talking about the shooting, I thought it was amazing or really unfortunate or heartbreaking when we had the shooting in Georgia, that everybody, because it was a massage spa, like everyone assumed that it was sexualized. And then when you got the ages of the victims, it was just a regular massage spa. But I was like, that tells me about people's implicit biases about Asian women and work and right, like, and all of those things and how it was narrated, and because they were invisible and we didn't get picture, like, I was just like, all a reflection of like rape culture and just how we dehumanize women's experiences, women's sexual, and we even as women do it to each other with what are you wearing, virgins and whores, right? Like even in our languaging, we reinforce it so much. And I know so much of your work is around helping us from every level and helping create support so that we have a critical consciousness around these things so that we're not causing more harm and, re-traumatizing ourselves and other people.
Yes. Yeah. And that's, again, why I think that the victim blaming is so intertwined with this objectification that we have, or that we tend to utilize in our society, which again, objectification literally just means that we view others as objects. So we are dehumanizing them. We are not seeing them as full humans who have their own deep, intense experiences as a person. And we view them as, someone recently tweeted this and it was deeply accurate, as NPCs. So if you play video games, as like non-player characters, right? We see them as just like objects that are a part of our human experience, but we aren't recognizing like the connectedness of all of our humanity. And when we objectify somebody, right, if we don't see someone as a full human being, then it does make it easier to either A, impart violence on them, right, or B, to rationalize the violence that they do receive, right, which again, like is tied in with those rape myths or that victim blaming of like, oh yes, because they were involved in X industry or because they had X identity, then they are deserving of that violence, right? Because I don't see them as full human beings. So it's a twisted narrative altogether at once. And I think that's the interesting part of a lot of this. It's often a both and, always at the same time.
And so that's probably a great segue. I want to talk about the intersections between those issues, because in a time where I think people are having an increased critical construct or understanding of race, racism, racialized violence, maybe to a little bit like a little less about that, but at least more open-minded. I mean, I think every organization's like going beyond cultural competency, and they're like, let's talk about diversity and equity and inclusion. I see so many DEI plans. But tell me, like, how, particularly when we think about sexualized violence, how do those things intersect, and then maybe we can even think about solutions and how, when you're addressing one set of issues, you might have an impact on the other. So where are those intersections between diversity, equity, and inclusion and sexual violence?
Yeah.
You're like, in words or less,
where
right?
to begin? Yeah. So if you think about those mechanisms we were just talking about, that rape culture, right? Those mechanisms are very easily translated into racialized violence as well, right? So we have that same victim blaming attitude around racialized violence, and we're seeing it in the media constantly, right? About, someone committed a minor crime, and so therefore they deserved the violence that was that they experienced, or why were they at X place at a certain time? Why were they carrying X or looking X way, right? And so I think there's a lot of parallels in those spaces. Again, that objectification of viewing someone as deserving of violence or as less than a person, and also those stereotypes or those myths that we reinforce about why somebody experiences violence, particularly when we're thinking about like racialized violence, or if we're thinking about like police violence, right? As those are so often unfortunately intertwined. There's a lot of that conversation going on too, about somehow this idea that if you commit a crime, then you deserve to experience violence, which is not true, right? There's policies and procedures that law enforcement are required to take that are nonviolent. But I think we still have that idea in our conversations here, and therefore that's what makes it feel, I think, why in the past we have not had these conversations at the same level, because people have so easily written them off. And I think thankfully we're starting, like you said, bringing it into the community conscious, and people are able to start to have deeper conversations and more interrogation with themselves, hopefully, about like, why are those my initial reactions? Why is that like the first thing that comes into my brain when I hear these stories? And how can I change that internal narrative or that internal bias within myself?
Yeah. And it's also complicated because when I think about like racialized violence and even the phrase Black Lives Matter, when we think about sexual violence, I know women of color, right? Like people don't most people still don't know that like the Me Too movement was, started by a Black woman about Black women's violations and experiences. And, she was saying, hey, Black women can be sexually assaulted too, because even when we think about sexual assault or sexual violence, so often, right, in terms of people's experiences, women of color, marginalized women, low income women, women identified, so women on the gender spectrum who are vulnerable just have been ignored in the conversation, right? Like historically, culturally, societally, and the sexual violence that has been perpetrated against white women has been so racialized, right? So then it gets even more complicated that I don't think people even tease apart. Like this is, so when women of color come forward, what does it mean to make a Black male perceived real, more vulnerable, or have contact with the system? Which is why you talked about what justice looks like. What does it mean to be involved in the criminal justice system when there's cross-racial violence, particularly if you're an advocate or an ally and you get sexually assaulted by someone from a group that you're advocate? Like, how do you tease that apart? How do you believe that people will believe you when there's secrecy and hidden stories, right? Like it's all so difficult. And I don't think that people who say, well, why don't more people come forward, or why aren't more people doing something about it? It is all so complicated. And I'm going to get off my soapbox and say one thing and change a little bit of the facts to keep, to maintain confidentiality. But I remember when I was working at the time it was Rape Crisis Services, when I was working at RCS, one of the hardest things for particularly families of color in this community, so this is many years ago, so this is not recent, but was, when it seemed like, based on the forensic evidence and just everything that was happening, that there was a preponderance of evidence that they were perpetrating, their children were assaulted, sexually violated, and then the court systems were unresponsive or normalized it or didn't respond. And it felt like so many young girls of color, their sexual violations just weren't held at the same regard as other people, right? Like, and so like what got media attention, what got people excited, what, and then we were also have girls, those same girls who were violated, younger, show up, and then they were missing school, and then they looked truant, and then they were fighting, and people would go, why is there so much bad behavior? And I had followed stories and I was like, like if people don't believe you, or take you seriously, or believe in your humanity, right? Your Black Lives Matter. It's kind of hard to, like, by the time you're in middle school, you're pretty pissed off, as you should be, about systems not being able to support you. And I don't think people often think about the complexity of how sexual violence shapes and defines, and how, when it's racialized and doesn't, we dehumanize people, how we see those things in society.
Yes. And, we talk often about how behavior is communication, right? And I think that's why it's so important that we are also providing trainings to other people in the community, because I would love if everyone reached out to races and got support. And I recognize that that often is not the first place where people will disclose, right? We often disclose our experiences to friends, families, right? Our support systems, the trusted adult we have in our family or in our lives, right? And so we want everyone to be able to respond to disclosures and trauma in an informed way, so that that first experience can lead them towards other resources or other supports. Because that first disclosure, we've seen the research come out for youth, for minors, that they often disclose 7 or more times before they're believed and directed to appropriate resources, right? That's a lot of burden to put on a minor. Most of these survivors are under 12 years old, right? To put the onus and burden on them to keep telling their story and keep disclosing to somebody and repeatedly not being believed or being dismissed about their experiences, right? And I can only imagine what that looks like, for folks who are either have experienced multiple forms of trauma or have been victimized multiple times. It's such a disheartening experience. And it totally makes sense that if that disclosure did not go well and you weren't supported and you weren't believed, you are gonna stop talking about it and stop wanting to access resources, right? Which we see all of the time. We see older survivors who maybe experienced their trauma years and years and years ago finally feel comfortable or safe to try to reach out for support again, right? Or maybe the person who wasn't supportive of them is no longer in their lives anymore, or they've reached a different milestone where now they feel safe to access those resources, right? Because you cannot heal, you cannot talk about trauma if you do not feel safe, right? We talk about that like reptilian brain. If you're still in that like survival mode all of the time, you're not going to be able to start talking about your experiences. So we need to, I think that's why it's so important we start thinking about like community responses to these things, right? Which is, I know, so much of what CU Try is doing to try to think about how we, as a community here in Champaign-Urbana, are thinking about these, because it's all so interconnected and intertwined with one another. We can't tease apart one issue from another.
Yeah. And so in even the generational traumas and community traumas, sometimes, again, we just think about like the gun violence, but I know locally, and I might want to ask you to spend a little bit of time to talk about how these issues show up and manifest themselves locally. But I know, these sort of trauma narratives that happen where generations of folks are like, hey, no one ever responded to me, manifest and shows up as symptoms of a community's disease, right? And I wish people were much more sensitive to like go to the roots and also see the resources, right? So let's talk about, let's shift a little bit and talk about what do you see locally, and then I'll talk about what Races offers.
Yeah. Gosh. When I think about, so particularly a lot of my job is in K through 12 spaces, right? I'm working a lot with young adults in these particular spaces that can be very traumatic in a lot of ways, right? So we're very interested in talking about education and creating a very trauma-informed space within our education and the way we do it with young folks. But I also recognize that is not always the case. So if we think about a young person's experience in a school or in a classroom, even more now within COVID times, right? Those spaces can be really great to access resources and getting connected to resources. And they can also be very, very traumatic if they are not appropriately created, or if you have a particular individual who is not culturally informed, who's not trauma informed, right? And I know this is so complicated, right? So we had those spaces maybe pre-COVID. Now we don't have those spaces. Majority of folks are online. Some students have returned into the classroom, but it's still just such a chaotic year that we have had, and that students have had. And we know that teachers and administration and folks at those levels are also scrambling around and trying to do their own stuff, and might also have their own trauma that has happened or that has come up over the past year, right? I think this is not specific to our community, but we've heard across the country, just teachers' narratives about how difficult it has been the past year, teaching to Black squares on a screen, to not knowing their students, to only having 25 minutes to talk to them, right? Whatever the constraints are that our teachers are trying to work within, right? That has also been really difficult for them too. Which is, again, why we need to think about these systemic levels of, Races wants to support students and we want to support teachers to do their jobs, as effectively as they can, and whatever we can do to support them, that's what we want to do. Which is where we always go with our decisions within the education department, particularly is like, how can we relieve burden from these teachers who have, and social workers and counselors as well, and administration, who have 5,000 things on their plates at all times. I have said it a bunch, I'll say it again. I think like everyone in education deserves like $1 million a year, because it's just it's so much. And they do so much for our youth and for our young people in our communities. So, we are a tangential part of that relationship, but we still want to try to have impact where we can.
So, wow, right? So I think that that's a perfect segue to sort of say, hey, you've still been here, still offering, and it's complex. And so one of the losses that students in the community might have experienced this year, right, like you're offering support, but maybe it isn't as robust or intentional or as comprehensive because, Maslow's hierarchy of need, right, like some broader conceptualization might not be happening because you're really focused on that practical skills, making sure that teachers, in some ways, I think primary prevention, right? Like when we think about what helps reduce sexual violence is, some of the cultural issues, but also reducing stress. And so you're like, hey, Karen, what we've been really digging deep in is reducing stress on students and with teachers. And I hope people see that, like, that is also a part of the prevention strategy. A lot of times people think like it's just scared straight or like, some like awful whatever. And it's your mission is broader and deeper than just going in and saying, don't know, and it's bad, right? Like you have a much more comprehensive framework that I think most people don't see.
Yeah. Yes. We want to go beyond just saying, don't commit assault and, don't violate other people. We want to show examples and empower folks to have positive relationships with others, right? And enjoy their sexual experiences, whatever that might be. I think you have to have both sides of the coin. We aren't just going to tell you a bunch of like, no, don't do this. We're going to talk a lot about like, here's how you can get it right. And here's what it looks like when it goes that way. Yeah. Right. And we even start that at a very, very young age, which I think is some of the biggest places we can see that primary prevention happen, right? Which literally just means trying to prevent something from happening in the first place, right? To stop sexual violence or child sexual abuse, doing some of those conversations with young people, helping them understand body autonomy, that your body belongs to you. And so you get to decide, how someone interacts with your body, what kind of touches they use, and you always get to say no, right? And that's, I think, such a hard thing for anybody in our society. Saying no and setting that hard boundary is like, is not often just like, it's very difficult to do. And I don't think it's ever like encouraged. So we encourage them to say no to a lot of stuff and get comfortable with saying no. And that, try not to get that blame of like saying no means you're a bad person or you're a bad friend or whatever that might be. Right. So those are like just some like baseline conversations that like you have a right over what that looks like. And it's okay to like set that boundary. And in some ways that feels very basic, but in other ways that's like a very revolutionary idea to talk to young folks about. Right. If even reflecting on my own experiences as a child, it's very common for us to infantilize children, right? Or to sort of have this idea that we can treat them again, like not as real human people, not as real human beings or full people, and tell them that they have to hug grandma goodbye or they have to give a kiss to, our aunt or the uncle or whatever it might be. And sort of to tell them what is okay and isn't okay to do with their bodies. And although in some instances we might have good intentions, right, it's really important to recognize that we're setting a precedent for what is okay for other adults or older folks in their lives to do too, who may or may not have good intention either. So, we really are starting from the beginning space, and we keep trying to level up and deepen these conversations while also still having to like go back and have those conversations again, because we might experience students in high school or in college that have never had those conversations, right? And so we always need to continue to reinforce those as well.
So not only have they, because I love the primary prevention, and to see this as an evolving process. You notice, I'm hoping people are in the audience are hearing, it is why parents have to be educated, teachers have to be educated, students have to be educated. We have to reinforce this in so many different levels, because I know, like, and even in my own life and narrative, and I do this work all the time, uh, I can know this, and then the skills, right? This is how shock trauma is shaping and defining, but particularly sexual violence, is that, learning to negotiate that personal boundary isn't just a head issue, it's a biochemical issue. We think about like trauma bonding in the face of domestic violence. And I think I'm mentioning this because I know how often I hear other women or teachers or young girls talk about girls being fast or poorly behaved, or making bad relationship decisions, right? Like, you name it, right? Like, we have all of these labels, again, part of that rape culture, and we don't understand that this isn't just like a thought issue, it's a biochemical issue. And so if someone has violated your ability to consent pretty early on, it could take a lot of reinforcements and love and care for you to get consent back. And so how do we have supports that say, yes, it's okay to say no and still be identified and still be thought of as nice and doesn't turn you into a bad person or any of those things, and that be both biochemical and intellectual. So I wish, we were so much more loving with each other when we saw behavior that looks like not necessarily functional or adaptive, and realizing it comes from sometimes really deep broken places.
Yeah. And it's why we need to be really intersectional when we think about these conversations, because the ability to set boundaries is also based off of the privileges that we have in our lives, right? So as a white person, I have different experiences, but as a woman, I also have different experiences of feeling comfortable setting boundaries, right? Then our Black students or that our students of color might have different experiences of setting boundaries and feeling comfortable setting those boundaries, right? When we talk to students about sexual harassment, we have conversations about why wouldn't someone set a boundary when they're experiencing harassment in particular spaces. And they do a really good job of recognizing that it might not feel safe. It might not even actually be safe, right? If you are alone with an individual who's perpetrating violence against you, it might not be safe to set a hard boundary, right? Because that might escalate the situation. And so, yeah, we need to have these like deeper, nuanced conversations about, how can we set our own boundaries? And then on the other end, how can we respect when other people set boundaries with us? And how can we create a space when we talk about consent? Like, how can we create a space of mutual respect where it is okay to say no, right? And we are okay with someone saying no. And we create that space for them to feel comfortable having that conversation instead of it feeling like a push to do something. Right.
Yeah, right. And I know that this is also part of the work, but how do we pay attention to what media is out, what people consume? And this is, a public in the day conversation, but the role of, pornography and other images that feed into rape culture that, say like people are always willing and ready and able, and that really, um, contort people's worldview, and it's being introduced to kids earlier and earlier and earlier, and it becomes part of the work around breaking some of those misconceptualizations, that just sort of get reinforced intentionally and sometimes unintentionally. Because again, I think in the media, when I listen to like the news around Brett Kavanaugh, the hearing, like just how the awareness of the impact on survivors, the impact on what it was, so much of boys will be boys, that like so much of how that got handled just reinforces rape culture myths more so than I think it actually was probably more re-traumatizing for so many people than a positive thing. And how is it that we, then have community conversations that say, okay, this was all the things that were wrong with how that story was narrated and told and shared, what happened? Because I bet you the numbers of, I did some reading, but the numbers of reported sexual assaults are actually have been going down. But I also know that during the Me Too movement, where there was a lot of talk about it, so much of what was covered might have created a backlash, because historically that's what happens, is the more we open up spaces and conversations, the more we actually shut folks' disclosure down. So I'm not sure.
Yes, it's also complicated, right? I think that that's often why we talk a lot about gender stereotypes too. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention, which is where we go a lot to see like best practices that are happening in the field. One of the biggest indicators of perpetration of violence is that adherence to gender norms, right? Which is just like belief in some of these ideas around who a person should or shouldn't be based off of their identity, real or perceived, right? So we put people into these boxes of man and women, and then we decide like, here's how you're supposed to act and how you're supposed to be. So we talk a lot about how that comes up in relationships, right? About like who asks the person on the date, who's the one who like pushes sexual situations forward, who gets to decide these conversations in your relationship, because that has a huge dynamic in those relationships, particularly if we're talking about heteronormative relationships, right, or a man and a woman. But even without outside of that dynamic, there's still a lot of this reinforcement of, the man asks on the date, but also he gets to decide where you go, and he pays for it. But then that reinforces this idea that because he paid for it, he deserves something sexual in return. And so, yeah, we have to kind of tear that apart as well, because that is part of how we have our relationships, and also a part of how we have our friendships too. I think that's so important. When we're having these conversations, we're talking about how to set boundaries or how to have consent in any relationship, right? Whether it's with our friends, with our teammates, with our colleagues, with our parents, with our siblings, right? We need to talk about all of the above. This is not just about like romantic relationships or partnerships. Again, because when we see or have certain type of relationships, that's modeled for us about what's like normal or expected. But also, when we work with middle school students, I think a lot back too about like, I think we all had like some terrible friendships in middle school because we were figuring out how to be friends with other people and like how to navigate those relationships. And so we also need to talk about that too, right? Those are equally important in folks' lives, and equally like a part of their history, right? So, yeah.
No.
It's all of the above all the time.
So we've talked a little bit about the role of education in terms of changing the culture and climate, helping people are like interest peaked, like going to races and like checking out the website. But what other supports, right? Like what other supports do you think people might need or benefit from, now and in the future during COVID? Like, let's talk about if I am a mom, a survivor, what might I need?
Yeah.
What might I get from races, and where else might I need to go?
Yeah. So again, we have that hotline, which is really wonderful and useful. I've also put information about some like chat hotlines. So one of the things that we know is that for people talking on the phone might not be like safe or possible right now. And so you can do a chat function through RAIN, which is sort of like the National Sexual Assault Network. Or there is the crisis text line, which you can text back and forth with somebody to have a conversation if you feel like you want to reach out for support. So there's sort of multiple modes for people, which I think is really important to know. And again, we're always here to answer questions that folks might have. I think some other really good resources that I always like to point people in the direction of is, of course, like sort of our partner agency, which is Courage Connection. They're the local domestic violence agency. A lot of the resources or sort of services I explained at the beginning that we offer, Courage Connection also offers as well, but for anyone who's experiencing domestic violence. And if people aren't sure which one they should go to, feel free to call us and we can support you in that way. We do a lot of referring back and forth and supports because, again, we know that these issues are really intertwined, but they also have a hotline available and they have some resources too. And then the other place that I like to let folks know about that I think is a really wonderful resource in our community is Uniting Pride. So Uniting Pride is our local LGBTQ plus agency. They have a lot of support systems. They have a lot of ways to access them. And they also have a lot of groups that people can be engaged with that are going on right now in more of a COVID friendly way via Zoom. which can be just a really great place for folks who identify within that LGBTQ plus or the queer community to receive support systems at this time for sort of like just a variety of experiences or needs. I think their staff over there are doing a really amazing job of creating programming and being able to direct people to, queer friendly resources or to, communities and agencies that are really understanding of those communities, and so people can feel safe accessing those.
And so, so I'm going to ask two other sort of more particular questions. One, because this is a question I get asked, is races just for women or women identified folks? So
Great question. No. Races is for everybody, regardless of your gender identity, sexual orientation, whatever that might be. We serve and support all folks. And people can access anybody that they're interested in accessing. I was gonna say we have some male staff and female identified staff, so if people have like questions about who they want to receive support from, we totally understand that might be a factor in receiving support, and we're more than willing to try to accommodate that as much as possible, but we do not turn anybody away.
Okay. And what if, so you mentioned that there were legal advocacy services, and I know that is so complicated, but I would like for you to explain both the hospital support or the community, the advocacy support, because that's where we started with. And then, so are these attorneys? Like, what do you mean? Like there's legal advocacy? I have no idea what that means. So help me understand.
I think the best way to describe the roles of our advocates is they are people who are there to like help you navigate the process, right? So our legal advocate knows all of the ins and outs of all of these systems, stays up to date with current policies or laws that are being passed. And so they can kind of be like your go-to person to say, here are the options that are available to you, right? This is what you can do if you're interested. So I'll just like name a few. If you want to file a police report, if you want to get a no contact order, which most people know is a restraining order, if you want to receive like economic support because of the like loss of property, or like you had to take time off because of your experiences, if you need to move, there's all these support systems that are available to you. And our advocate can kind of be the expert to say, here's how it works, here's the processes, here's the steps, right? And like, I'll support you through this. So they're not a lawyer. We're not legal attorneys. We don't provide legal advice, but we can help you understand like what the systems are and what your choices are that you have. And again, that is similar for our medical advocates. So when people go to the hospital, they will have a medical advocate that's just there to say, here are all of the options you have available to you. You can choose one, you can choose all of them, right? And this is what it looks like if you do choose them. So they're there to really help you understand and navigate that process. I think a wonderful thing, I've worked in other states doing sexual violence work. A wonderful thing about Illinois is we have a lot of rights for survivors. Like we have so many things available to survivors, and they're getting improved and expanded every year, which is amazing. And it means there's a lot of information to know, which is why we have advocates who really stay on top of that, right? I think the big law that we often refer to is SECEDA, which is the Sexual Assault Survivors Emergency Treatment Act, which essentially says what rights do sexual assault survivors have at the hospital. And I think that bill now is like over 50 pages. Like it is very intense. And so we just want to be able to help people translate that. And so they understand that they have those options, and also just ensuring that when you go to the hospital, like your rights are being upheld, right? Which we are so lucky to have such a good partnership with Carl, that they also are really on board with us with that mission and want to ensure that SECEDA is upheld and survivors have their rights respected. But it's always just nice to have an expert in the room on those matters.
So, okay, so has medical advocacy been in place during COVID? So
yes, there was a short period of time when we were on the phone, but we are now back in person. So our medical advocates will meet people like physically at the hospital. So typically what tends to happen is when someone goes to the emergency room, if they identify as a survivor, or they're saying like their main reason for coming to the hospital is because of sexual assault, the hospital will call us and they'll say, hey, can you send over an advocate? So you don't have to like do anything to make that happen. And then you will be escorted to your own room. It's a private room. Our advocate will be there to walk you through all your options and choices. And that visit, I think the biggest thing to know is that that visit will be free of charge, right? You don't have to pay anything out of pocket for the visit to the hospital. Your insurance might be billed, but you will not have to pay anything out of pocket for the experience or for that care that you need. And of course, if there's any questions about that while someone's there, again, that's what our medical advocates are there for, to help navigate that system. But they're back in person, and they have been unfortunately very busy as of late. So
that's really unfortunate.
yeah, it's always a double-edged sword, because we're really happy that folks are receiving the services that they need, and that we have a strong partnership with Carl where we're getting called out, and we're getting a lot of calls. So
yeah. And you probably would want to add, just so that people know, just because you get medical advocacy support does not mean that you have to then follow through with any of the legal procedures. It's just, like historically, we were talking before we joined the call, historically, it was just because most of sexual assault and domestic violence supports started by peers, like regular people. They just knew having someone who could guide you through that process when you were most vulnerable was the best support to help you with your recovery, like just to help you navigate. It is an emotionally intense experience. So no, it doesn't obligate you to anything. Won't be used against you. There is confidentiality. The medical advocate won't be called to testify. Like, it is really just a private experience that is just designed to support you in a really vulnerable time to help you navigate. So I always want to let people know, like, there is no, like, it doesn't mean like, hey, you got a free service, so there's a caveat, like there's a catch,
yeah.
like we want something from you. That is not how it's designed.
No, yeah, all of our services are totally free. And what we mean by that is, like, we don't even ask for insurance. We don't bill anybody. So we don't ask any of those questions. When people go to the hospital, that does not mean that you have to make a police report to receive services from us. It does not mean you have to make a police report. And I always like to tell people about our confidentiality, that it is a super high level of confidentiality, which is great. It's known as absolute privilege here in the state of Illinois. And we take it super seriously, because if we break confidentiality, like, that is a misdemeanor on our end, right? So it's really important for us that people know that they have places where they can talk through their options and really ask questions and get their needs met without having any other mechanisms in place, right? To know that you can speak freely without being concerned about who that's going to be shared with, or because you told me X, I'm going to have to tell Y person, or whatever that might be, right? So you can call and tell us whatever, talk about whatever you want. I also like to let people know, when they reach out to the hotline, you can use whatever name you want. We don't really care, as whatever you want me to call you, or however you want to be identified. If it makes you feel safer to not use your real name, that's cool too, right? Whatever makes people feel safe, and what makes people feel comfortable, then that works best for us.
Wow. So I figured we would use the last few minutes to sort of do some imagining, right? So this is, I know you have an upcoming 40-hour training. I'd love for you to say more, but one of the questions, right, if I remember from the training that you ask people to speculate, is imagine a world without sexual violence. So do the commercial for the 40-hour training. We'll make sure people know how to find that. So let's do that. And then let's do some imagining the world without sexual violence. So
yes. So our 40-hour training is literally 40 hours, which is why we call it that. And it is for people who are interested on being one of those volunteers who answers those hotline calls on our 24/7 hotline, or if someone is a professional in our community who just really wants to know more about how to support survivors and respond to trauma within their job description. So I run our 40-hour training, so you'll see a lot of me talking a lot, which I love. And if you're interested, feel free to go on our website and you can learn more. But yes, like our mission at Races is to see a world without sexual violence. And that is in some ways like a very radical idea. But what we hope is that like we are changing, culture in the world. And I think that that is happening in very small doses, which is very exciting. And I am so excited to see how that changes even more. Seeing the culture change that's even happened in the last 10 years since I've been in this work. And I think we've seen, in the United States, the conversation we've been having around sexual assault has been evolving. And I hope we continue to push those conversations and have those uncomfortable dialogues with our communities. And I hope we find ways to think about like what accountability looks like within our community. I know we touched on that earlier, but trying to be really imaginative about, how do we hold people accountable when they cause harm to others? And what does that look like? And how do we do that in a way that feels appropriate for the survivor, right? In terms of if you're the one who had you experienced harm, I think you get to have some say in what that accountability gets to look like. And it's going to be different for everybody. But I think that we can get so much more creative about that. And I think we can get so much more creative about like how we think about preventing sexual violence, right? So of course we do a lot of the sort of what's considered traditional prevention of like teaching about these ideas, having conversations. But a lot of this, again, is so intertwined with other things, just like having access to education and having access to job opportunities and having some of these like safe and accessible and affordable experiences. Those are all part of the equation as well, right? So I think we can also get creative about how we do the prevention work too. That's just outside of having conversations. I think we can think structurally about some of that stuff. So I love thinking about those things because I hope that we can kind of level ourselves up as a society to move beyond some of this 101. And I think we even have. I've been so excited about some of the data we've been getting from our kiddos and from our young folks to see that some of these conversations are concepts that maybe felt like very groundbreaking when I was a teenager, like the understanding that sexual assault happens to people of all genders and can be perpetrated by people of all genders is now very like baseline conversation for them. Like they always are looking at me like,
but of course,
like, of course, why are you asking me that question? And so it's like, that's great. I'm so glad that it seems stupid that I'm talking about this. So we can move on and have different conversations. And I just hope we continue to see that strengthen and grow over the years. I have so much faith and optimism in our younger generation. And I think it's so important to think about everybody and all their experiences, right? I think Karen, you and I had that conversation a little while ago about wanting to not just focus on youth, but focusing on everybody. But I do think that if we continue to have these culture changes, that hopefully all survivors of all ages and identities can feel supported, no matter how long ago their experience happened or where it happened, right? That they still feel like they can reach out for support.
Wow, I love that vision. And I just want to sort of co-sign that. I also, when I think about a world without sexual violence, I think about a world without violence. And because so many of our issues are interconnected. And so if you are also somebody who's interested in equity and diversity and inclusion, there's a lot, like I know your primary audience are volunteers, but also there's a huge anti-oppression lens because you realize from a power analysis, as long as certain groups of people feel like they have to have power and control over other groups of people. And when we think about sexual violence, we're thinking about control over people's bodies. You will always have sexualized violence, and in a world that is more democratic and egalitarian and loving and connected, where we have the power of we, and it's not so hierarchical, right? Then we can really move to these newly actualized, right, like vision. So, it's why I advocate for a trauma-informed community, because it has to be anti-oppression. So I'm also hoping people will see the training and hear the language and, as their own personal homework assignment, imagine what it would take like, so we wouldn't shame and guilt. We would get rid of, we'd have to tackle racism if we wanted to get rid of sexual violence. We'd have to have a power analysis around whiteness and patriarchy if we want to. Like, all of those isms are so interconnected. And, because sexual violence is an equal opportunity like it happens to everybody. And as long as people with power can inflict it on other people and systems reinforce it, we'll be forever trudging along. So let's dream big.
I would love, yes. I think that would be, so fantastical to imagine. And we have to have, sort of this like radical optimism sometimes, because there's this sort of like, often I talk about like reckless optimism that I have, because, you have to continue to imagine those spaces, right? Because if we think about where we want to go, we want it to be very different than where we are now, which means we have to be able to like imagine these different futures, right? And thinking about even like where I get that from, right? That comes from, that sort of like Afrofuturism, Black scholars talking about this and have been talking about it forever. One of my favorite quotes that I guess I'll kind of end on, that I think about a lot, Adrienne Marie Brown, who wrote Emergent Strategy and is just like an amazing scholar and like theorist, in her book talks about how nobody is special and everyone is needed. And I love that.
Perfect way to end. I have loved this conversation. I hope we've educated people a little bit more about racism and sexual violence, and hopefully people are like sitting at home thinking, imagining this world. And thank you so much, and for all the great work that you do for and behalf of the community. It's just been a pleasure.
Yes, of course. Thank you for having us. And yes, anyone and everyone watching, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or are curious about if we can do services for you or provide for you. Like, we're always here. So
thank you.